What's going on, Packer fans? Happy Sunday. Welcome into another episode of the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can also follow me on Threads at Andy Herman NFL. Really appreciate you being here today. Can't you feel it? The anticipation growing, the excitement growing. I know it's a Sunday. I know we don't have football quite yet, but before you know it, it's going to be training camp, then family night, and then it's going to be preseason football. And just in the nick of time, it's going to be Packers, Bears opening week, and it's just going to be absolutely amazing. So you can feel that excitement and anticipation growing just a little bit. Before we get there, we still have a ton to discuss here on the Pack a Day podcast, 365 days a year. So make sure you are subscribed if you have not already. Always appreciate that. But today, I am going to rip off the one and only Zach Kruse. And if you have not had the opportunity to check out his article yet, time out. Hit pause, go do it right now. You can check it out over at packerswire.com. He did a phenomenal article basically doing the ultimate Aaron Rodgers, Brett Favre team. So the best team you could possibly assemble over the past 30 years. He pulled, I think, 25 of the best Packers writers and bloggers and everyone you could possibly imagine to get a consensus on this ultimate 53-man roster in the Aaron Rodgers and Brett Favre era combined. I was lucky enough to be one of the people that was picked to be part of that process, which was really, really fun. And a lot of, just a lot of time, effort, and energy goes into it to try to figure out like who are the best players on this roster. So it was a lot of fun to do, but definitely go check out that article. But in a effort to, sort of spin off of that a little bit and provide you guys with some fun conversation, I figured we would just take it and do the second part of it, which is the Aaron Rodgers era and what is the best ultimate 53-man roster that we can put together just using the time that Aaron was in Green Bay. We know now that Aaron's time in Green Bay is ultimately over. He is a member of the New York Jets. The trade is done, signed, sealed, delivered. So it is fun to look back in retrospect and look at what is the best possible 53-man roster that you can put together in just the Aaron Rodgers era. So A, appreciate you, Zach Kruse, for putting together the amazing article. B, appreciate that I was able to be a part of that. And C, appreciate you giving me the idea and sparking the idea to take that second piece of it and just doing it for this. But again, definitely go check out Zach's article over on Packers Wire. So let's do it. Let's run through it right now. We're going to go through the ultimate 53-man roster in the Aaron Rodgers era. We'll start off with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. And then I only added one other quarterback on this list, and that was Matt Flynn. I don't think there's an argument to be made for any other quarterback. I don't think you're going Seneca Wallace. I don't think you're going Scott Tolzien. The one you could maybe make a small argument for is Jordan Love. And I think the reason being is Jordan Love is the heir apparent. He is going to take over for Aaron Rodgers. But if we just look at the body of work for Jordan, well, it was during the Aaron Rodgers era. We got one start, which was very forgettable. We got a really nice appearance in the Eagles game a season ago. And based on what we saw in totality last year in preseason and that small spurt against the Eagles and just a couple other throws in other games here and there, I think you can make the argument that the upside of Jordan Love is clearly higher than what it was for Matt Flynn at any point in his career, even though he did get that big contract and the opportunity to theoretically start in Seattle before they drafted Russell Wilson. I still think you have to make the argument that if we're just basing it on their actual overall play in Green Bay during the time that they were with Aaron Rodgers, to me, it's Matt Flynn, and it's a no-brainer. So you could make, again, the argument overall of like, which quarterback would you rather have, Jordan Love at his ceiling or, Matt Flynn at his ceiling, and say, hey, I'm going to take Jordan Love. That's fine. So be it. But based on the actual performances, I'm going Matt Flynn as the backup quarterback here. So two quarterbacks on the roster, Aaron Rodgers and Matt Flynn. Going with three halfbacks, three running backs. I'm starting with Aaron Jones. I think he is the clear and obvious number one running back in the Aaron Rodgers era. Number two, I'm going with Ryan Grant, who, if you remember that beginning of the Aaron Rodgers era, Ryan Grant was so freaking good. And you remember that the divisional round game where he played so well against the Seattle Seahawks. That early Ryan Grant stuff was really, really freaking good. So he came in at number two. I think you could make some arguments for some, other running backs, maybe a Jamal Williams, maybe an AJ Dillon, maybe a James Starks, Brandon Jackson, not the, statistical body of work, but some of the stuff that he did as a third down back and blitz pickups, things like that, maybe you could make the argument. But I'm going Eddie Lacy here. I know that the stint wasn't super long. I know that there were some runs where you would have liked to seen him maybe be in a little bit better shape towards the end of his career and those sort of things. But prime Eddie Lacy was really freaking good. And I will take him quite easily as the number 3 running back on the roster here. So 3 running backs: Aaron Jones, Ryan Grant, and Eddie Lacy. At fullback, I am going John Kuhn. I don't think there's any other argument to be made here in the Rodgers era. It is John Kuhn. I am definitely keeping the fullback, and it doesn't seem appropriate to have a 53-man Aaron Rodgers, roster without having, John Kuhn on the team in some capacity. So John Kuhn gets the fullback nod. At wide receiver, this one was also pretty simple. Again, if you want to make the argument for the upside of Christian Watson and what we saw a season ago, even that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to make that argument for the 6 wide receivers that are on this roster. Ultimately, we're going to start, and these are not in any particular order, and how you want to, order these 6 is totally up to you. I will say number 1 is in order, and that's Davante Adams. Davante Adams, number 1 on my list in the Aaron Rodgers era. Jordy Nelson, then you've got Donald Driver, even though it was, sort of tail end of his, stint in Green Bay and in his career overall, still easily putting Driver on that list. Greg Jennings, I know the angst between Rodgers and Jennings, whatever, he was still an incredible, amazing, and I think actually still underrated wide receiver during his time in Green Bay. And then Randall Cobb and James Jones, you can't make a Aaron Rodgers 53 without including them as well. So I'm keeping 6 wide receivers on this team. Again, Davante Adams, Jordy Nelson, Donald Driver, Greg Jennings, Randall Cobb, and James Jones. A real ridiculous amount of riches for, his overall time in Green Bay. We can have the whole conversation of, he never had a first round pick and stuff like that. It doesn't matter. Those 6 were fantastic. Then of course you had guys like Alan Lazard, MVS. You had, Christian Watson this past season. We'll see what he ultimately becomes. But those 6 to me were pretty clear cut and dry. At tight end, I'm going with 3. I had one honorable mention in Donald Lee, who I think you could maybe make a small argument for, but I don't think over the 3 tight ends that I ultimately kept. Prime Jermichael Finley, easily number 1 on this list. Had he been able to stay healthy, I think, we would have been talking about Jermichael Finley in a very different light for his time with the Packers. But the Packers have been trying to replace that Jermichael Finley production and just overall skill set basically since he went down with his injuries. Number 2 on my list is Mercedes Lewis, the big dog. Again, it feels appropriate to have him on this team. It's not maybe the super high-end number 2 tight end that maybe we're hoping for in the Aaron Rodgers era. And I think you can make a very large argument that they didn't do a good enough job of putting tight ends around him during his time in Green Bay. They tried with Jimmy Graham. It just didn't work. They tried with, Martellus Bennett. We don't like to say his name, but they tried with him and it didn't really work out clearly either. So they tried some things. It just didn't work, but Finley won. And then Mercedes Lewis, just his blocking alone is worth putting him on this list. The best blocking tight end in football, in my opinion, during his time in Green Bay. So that earns him a nod. And then number 3 is Robert Tonyan. Like I said, Donald Lee may be in the conversation, but I think if you look at the overall body of work, I think Tonyan's was simply just better. I think we forget quite easily Tonyan's the year before he tore his ACL, was phenomenal. Over 10 touchdowns, or right around there if I remember correctly, and he was really coming into his own as a overall tight end. And to me, he is the unquestioned number 3 on this list. I don't think there's anyone else you can really make an argument for. So Finley, Lewis, and Tonyan at tight end as my 3. I went with 4 offensive tackles. David Bakhtiari, clear and obvious. Chad Clifton, wasn't a ton of time overall with Aaron. It was just the beginning of his stint as a starter, but still good enough to keep there. Brian Bulaga, quite clearly, Iowa. And then Mark Tauscher as well. Same thing with Clifton. Wasn't a ton of time, but it's hard to make an argument for anyone else as those third and fourth spots. But besides Chad Clifton and Mark Tauscher, even though the stints were super long with Aaron at the beginning, they were still talented enough by far and away to make the list. So Bakhtiari, Clifton, Bulaga, and Tauscher at tackle. I went with 5 interior offensive linemen on the whole. 3 guards: Josh Sitton, TJ Lang, and Elton Jenkins. 3 really, really good players. Josh Sitton, all-pro at his height. TJ Lang, I don't know if he did, but certainly in the conversation for a Pro Bowl caliber player. And then Elton Jenkins, what more needs to be said? All the versatility that he's had, plus the high-end play at guard as well. So those are my 3 guards. And then 2 centers. The one that I debated keeping here was J.C. Treader. I think if Treader would have ultimately ended up, remaining the starter and not had the injuries and things like that, he probably would have made this list over the second guy that I'm going to name here in just a second. But number one, clear and obvious, was Corey Linsley. And then number two is Scott Wells. And I think you could make the argument that Treader was just a better center than Scott Wells. At least it's an argument. But I think the longevity, and Wells played really well when he was in Green Bay as well. Like, I think that is a player that gets undervalued from time to time. So I'm going with Scott Wells is there. So offensive line, Bakhtiari, Clifton, Bulaga, and Tauscher, Sitton, Lang, and Jenkins, and then Corey Linsley and Scott Wells. So that is my offensive side of the ball. On the defensive side of the ball, I'm going to go with 5 defensive linemen, 1 begrudgingly, 1 honorable mention. My honorable mention is Johnny Jolly. My top 4 that I easily kept were Kenny Clark, Mike Daniels, Ryan Pickett, and Cullen Jenkins. Jenkins is another one of those that was just sort of on the tail end, of his career at the beginning of Aaron Rodgers' era, but still played, I think, 3 years at the beginning of that. So still an easy keep on Cullen Jenkins, and his high-level play was really freaking good. Clearly in the Super Bowl as well was still phenomenal. So I'm going with Pickett, Jenkins, Mike Daniels, and Kenny Clark as my top 4. I think prime Mike Daniels still doesn't get the credit that he quite deserves. Kenny Clark, obviously number 1 in this list. Ryan Pickett was such an awesome signing by Ted Thompson. The one that I'm keeping begrudgingly is BJ Raji. I am not a BJ Raji guy, and nothing against him. I think, I'm sure he's an awesome person and he has a huge cult following. I think he is maybe the most overrated player of the last 30 years, in my opinion, for the Packers. I think people forget his last couple seasons were not good in Green Bay. He did not play anywhere up to his standard, but high-end BJ Raji, when he first came in, was still a really darn good player. So he kept, he's on my list as number 5. But if I had only kept 4, I would not have kept BJ Raji on this list. I would have kept Pickett, Jenkins, Daniels, and Clark all ahead of him. We can have that whole conversation another day. I even kind of wanted to keep Johnny Jolly ahead of BJ Raji, but I couldn't do that. So Raji gets my 5th spot, Johnny Jolly as an honorable mention. All right, edge rusher. Clay Matthews, number 1, undisputed, no question about it. I'm going Zadarius Smith, number 2. Zadarius has such an interesting career arc in Green Bay because his first year in Green Bay is on the level of any other season that I've ever seen a Packer play. I would probably only put like the best Aaron Rodgers season ahead of what I've seen from Zadarius Smith in that 1 year. I would put it on par, and then maybe like the defensive player of the year, Charles Woodson, season on there as well. I would argue that it was as good as any season Reggie White put up in Green Bay. Like, I think that 1 year out of Zadarius was just absolutely phenomenal and unbelievable for what he was able to accomplish. Year 2 was a decent amount of splash plays, but the overall play took a hit significantly. Still a really good player in year 2. Year 3, completely injured, some bizarre, just, the captain stuff that happens, and then he's gone. So you get this unbelievable year, you get a good year, you get no year, and then out of Green Bay, and then he becomes a Minnesota Viking. So a very weird career arc, but that 1 year in and of itself was just phenomenal. So Matthews 1, Zadarius 2. I'm going Julius Peppers 3, even though he wasn't quite in his prime at the time, still a phenomenal player. Rashawn Gary 4. I've been rewatching this past season, as you know. Prior to the ACL, Rashawn Gary was just on such a freaking tear last year. He was so good. I'm easily putting him at number 4. And then number 5, I am giving a nod to Preston Smith as well. So he also makes the list. Matthews, Z, Peppers, Gary, and Preston, quite the group at edge rusher. Couldn't quite get Nick Perry on there. Aaron Campman had sort of, I think, a year or two at the very tail end of his career, but that was not prime Aaron Campman. So you can make an argument for him as well. But I'm going Matthews, Smith, Peppers, Gary, and Smith at edge rusher. Inside linebacker, Nick Barnett, number 1. And then the next order of the 3, you can all decide on. But the next 3 that I kept, A.J. Hawk, Devondre Campbell, Desmond Bishop. Campbell's an interesting one. First team All-Pro 1 year. And then the next year did not play very, very well. We'll see what he ultimately becomes in year 3, which won't matter for this because that won't be an Aaron Rodgers year anyway. But he did have a first team All-Pro season, which you can't ignore. Desmond Bishop, to me, easily makes the team. I love what he did in the Super Bowl. And then A.J. Hawk's the one for me where I think this is another one that's slightly overvalued because he was drafted so high. I think A.J. Hawk had a lot of tackles, 5 to 6 yards down the field, and wasn't a super aggressive player, was not a playmaker, didn't have a ton of sacks, forced fumbles, interceptions, etc. But I still think well-rounded enough to ultimately make this list as a top 4 inside linebacker in the Aaron Rodgers era. So Barnett, Hawk, Campbell, and Bishop. Corner, another interesting list here. Charles Woodson, 1A. Jair Alexander, 1B. Tramon Williams, 1C. Then I think a step below that, you've got Sam Shields. I'm still putting Al Harris on there, only a couple of years of Al Harris in the Aaron Rodgers era, but still putting him on that list. And then I'm going Casey Hayward as well. And I know that Casey Hayward became a better version of himself once he was out of Green Bay. I still think those final couple years in Green Bay were pretty darn good. And I still think top any other season of any other Packer that you would put on this list. So I'm going Woodson, Alexander, Williams, Shields, Harris, and Hayward at corner. At safety, Nick Collins, the clear and obvious number 1. I'm going Adrian Amos as my number 2, Morgan Burnett as my 3, and then same thing here in the Casey Hayward sort of logic. I'm still going Micah Hyde as number 4. He played well at corner and safety when he was in Green Bay, was an awesome punt returner. We all know Green Bay should have never left him leave, and he ultimately became a much better player in Buffalo than he ended up in Green Bay. But at the same token, we saw all the talent on display. I put him on this list over HaHa Clinton-Dix. I know HaHa had the one second-team All-Pro season. That was a very good season from HaHa. There's no question about it, but everything else just was very subpar for me, so I couldn't quite get him on that list. If you want to put HaHa on over Hyde or Burnett, that's fine, but I'm sticking with Hyde on this list. All right, kicker, obviously Mason Crosby. Punter, I'm going Tim Mastay. Long snapper, Brett Good. Returner, I know it was one season. It was one of the best returners. It was like a half a season. It was one of the best returner seasons I've seen from a Green Bay Packer outside of Desmond Howard. I'm going Keyshawn Nixon. And it's crazy that his one half of a season as a returner is arguably the best returner that Green Bay has had in the Aaron Rodgers era. Will Blackman certainly in the conversation as well, but I'm going with Keyshawn Nixon there. Special teamer, I'm going with Jarrett Bush. You could make an argument for Jeff Janis there as well, but I am ultimately going with Jarrett Bush. So my 53-man ultimate Aaron Rodgers team: Aaron Rodgers and Matt Flynn at quarterback, Aaron Jones, Ryan Grant, and Eddie Lacy at running back, John Kuhn at fullback, Devontae Adams, Jordy Nelson, Donald Driver, Greg Jennings, Randall Cobb, and James Jones at wide receiver, Jermichael Finley, Mercedes Lewis, and Robert Tonyan at tight end, David Bakhtiari, Chad Clifton, Brian Bulaga, and Mark Tauscher at tackle, Josh Sitton, TJ Lang, and Elton Jenkins at guard, Corey Lindsley, Scott Wells at center, Kenny Clark, Mike Daniels, Cullen Jenkins, Ryan Pickett, and BJ Raji along the defensive line, Clay Matthews, Zadarius Smith, Julius Peppers, Rashawn Gary, and Preston Smith along the edge, Nick Barnett, AJ Hawk, Devondre Campbell, and Desmond Bishop at off-ball linebacker, Charles Woodson, Jair Alexander, Tramon Williams, Sam Shields, Al Harris, and Casey Hayward at corner, Nick Collins, Adrian Amos, Morgan Burnett, and Micah Hyde at safety, Mason Crosby kicker, Tim Mastay punter, Brett Good long snapper, Keyshawn Nixon returner, and Jarrett Bush special teamer. That is going to do it for me today. Always appreciate you guys being here. I'll be right back here tomorrow with an all-new episode, so don't miss it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to get those notifications for all the new episodes. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.